for being here. Oop, recording in progress.
Yeah, and Elise, you know what? I will first introduce you, if you don't
Sure,
mind. So,
sure.
Elise is eager to get started, which we love. But I first would like to welcome everybody to yet another exciting webinar in our Music for Pain webinar series. Um, and today we have Elise Desbarats, who will be presenting on neural correlates of musically induced hypoalgesia. And Elise is a PhD student in experimental psychology, and she's in the lab of Mathieu Roy at McGill University. And Mathieu is one of the core investigative team members of the Music for Pain Research Network. And before we get started, just a little household directions. If you have questions for Elise, if you could please put them in the Q&A at the bottom rather than using the chat, that would be very much appreciated. I will keep an eye on the questions that come in. And we typically will do the Q&A at the end of the sessions, but if any urgent question that comes in that needs to be answered in order for you to be able to understand the rest of the webinar, I might interject Elise with a question. But typically we'll just wait till you're done with your presentations and then go into the Q&A. So without further ado, Elise, thank you so much for your willingness to present for us today. So take it away.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. So yeah, as Yoka mentioned, I'm a PhD student working with Mathieu Roy at McGill. And my main research question for my degree involves gaining a more mechanistic understanding of the effects of music on pain. So the idea of my presentation today is to try and communicate what I mean by that, as well as along the way sharing some of my research. So the goal is to start with a more conceptual introduction of what mechanistic research is, and then use two of my studies to demonstrate them as applications. So my hope today is that you can take something away, even if you don't work directly with the exact techniques that I use. So to begin, I'm going to start with a definition of what a mechanistic trial is, so it's an experiment designed to understand a biological or behavioral process or the mechanism of action behind an intervention. And I bring the definition up just because an important point is that this fundamentally differs from efficacy research, which instead is more so examining whether an intervention is associated with an outcome in order to see if it's helping, harming, or not doing anything. Whereas by contrast, mechanistic research has slightly different goals. So instead of looking at maybe more a general effect of music, we want to then ask if we can associate a specific process or mechanism that is changed by music. And so as a result, we have a lot of different targets for research. So this might include mechanisms like brain imaging, non-neural physiological measurements like heart rate variability or salivary markers, as well as self-report measures. And they can also be tested in several ways. So we can directly manipulate them in certain animal models, but we can also look at these in humans using experimental design that manipulates the target mechanism, as well as an extension of that, which is mediation studies. So I'm going to talk more so about those last two. But first, you might be wondering, okay, why do we care? Why should we care about mechanisms? Why should clinicians care? Isn't it good enough, on one hand, to have outcome research and effect sizes from systematic reviews? So I'd argue that there are many reasons why understanding mechanisms matter, but I'm going to focus on two. And the first is probably the most obvious. So it's just that understanding mechanisms speeds up the pace of progress. So for instance, here we have an estimation of the cumulative number of major discoveries by year, and we can see that it explodes following the scientific revolution of the 17th century. And that's because without a good mechanistic understanding of how things work, the alternative is to be left with a more lengthy and more cumbersome process of trial and error. And so a second advantage of mechanistic research is that we can try and connect our effects with other ideas and embed the effects of music on pain into a larger conceptual structure in order to get a deeper understanding. So for instance, we might hypothesize that music reduces pain because it's pleasurable and associated with the release of dopamine. And so in that framework, the effects of music on pain could resemble the effects of other rewards. And that hypothesis might be correct, incorrect, correct in some respects, but incorrect in other respects. But what's more important is that by trying to connect the effects of music on pain to these other concepts, we are exposing it to observation, and that's the scientific way of handling data. And so there are a number of more concrete benefits that we get from this deeper understanding. So the first is that connecting the effects of music to objective measures like dopamine release can help demonstrate that the effects of music are more than just a response bias, that they are in a sense real. It also allows us to exclude wrong hypotheses or hypotheses that are non-scientific, which could potentially be harmful for patients. And finally, a deeper understanding of the underlying physiological or neural mechanisms could help to integrate music further within the broader biomedical paradigm. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about what this actually looks like when we are constructing and designing experiments. So I'll talk a little bit about the fundamentals of good experimental design, some other considerations, and then how mediation also relates to this kind of framework. So the first most common way to investigate a mechanism is based on design, where the core is really that we're trying to come up with good subtractive logic. So the idea is that we're comparing two conditions where one has our target mechanism, which in my case today, I'm going to use pleasantness as an example. And you would want to show that when you remove that target mechanism, the effects on pain are not there. And to do this, we need a control condition that does not have that key feature. So two common choices often for comparing with self-selected favorite music, which we assume people would find very pleasant, are silence and experimenter selected music. And the idea there is that in both of these cases, it would be not as pleasant. However, it's also important that we think about the confounding factors when choosing a good control. So with music, we want to show that it's not just about having a generic auditory stimulus, that just kind of any noise would work the same way. And another consideration is that when we're using self-selected music, participants have a sense of control. So to continue my example, in these two cases, silence is not a particularly informative control in this case because we're not really accounting for either of those two confounds, but at least with experimental selected music, we can account for some level of auditory stimulation. And so all of this is to say, it is generally quite hard to find a control, especially for a complex intervention like music. But I wanted to show more generally how we kind of structure our thinking around potential confounds, but most importantly, having good subtractive logic. And so a second consideration of experimental designs is that even if you have a very tight experimental manipulation and a great control, ideally, it would also be good to take a measure to confirm what you think you are manipulating. So I might compare, on one hand, pleasant music versus controls and assume that I'm manipulating emotional valence. Or, I could make a decision about what I think is relaxing music. But to make a more solid inference, you also want to get an idea of how successful your manipulation was. So I'll give an example, is that for one of my experiments, people are listening to their favorite music that they've said they like a lot inside the MRI scanner, which is not a very ideal environment for listening to music. It's very cramped, it's very loud. So in my study, I added a check to the design where they asked how much they were enjoying the music in the scanner, to get an idea of how much they liked it in the study itself, without just assuming that because it was their favorite music, that they then were finding it highly pleasurable and rewarding. And so, like I just described as well in the depth of knowledge slide, it's using these manipulation checks can also act to connect your particular mechanism to other measures. So if you take heart rate, that's another opportunity to link your study to the broader network of concepts. And so an extension of this sort of thinking and this sort of design, if you're thinking about a good manipulation and you're checking it, it's easy to then combine those principles and extend your design into a mediation framework, which is the second approach I'm going to talk about as a method of building mechanistic understanding. So what mediation is it's a family of statistical approaches where we are modeling pathways between variables. So we're testing if the evidence is consistent with a set of paths where our experimental manipulation is predicting changes in a measured mediator, And crucially, the changes in that mediator should then predict pain. And so one of the main reasons why you would do this is because it's also entirely possible that music might change that mediator, but that change might not necessarily be what's impacting pain. And another advantage of this is that it can also, as a way, act as a manipulation check, like that A path there, because in theory, our design should change the mediating variable. And just to go a bit further and to stage my studies myself a bit more, often for within subject designs where we're having the same person go through multiple conditions, the independence assumption for standard linear regression is violated because these observations are nested within individuals. And so one way to address this is to use multi-level models, which account for the nested structure of the data by modeling both the variability within people and also between people, but still test for the effect at the population level. And so I'm introducing this here just as a primer because this is what I've used in my studies for both behavioral and neuroimaging data. And so I'm going to give you examples of two studies where I've used this sort of broader mediation framework to find out about the effects of music on pain. So for the first, a behavioral study, we used mediation in a paper where we wanted to look at how the qualities of music might impact pain through participants' emotional experience. So we systematically varied 3 psychological dimensions of music, which were arousal, so music might be more calm to more tense, valence, ranging from more sad to happy, and depth, which was more about the structural and emotional complexity of music. And so these dimensions come from a data-driven model that was developed by our colleague David Greenberg. And the idea is that they were based on a lexical approach of summarizing and identifying the key dimensions of all the different ways people might describe music. I won't get too into the details of it right now, but I'm happy to answer questions about the model. So with this set of songs that varied on these 3 dimensions, we then had participants complete a music listening task where they listened to various songs where we knew the model's scores for each of these dimensions. And then they received painful thermal stimulations and then rated how bad was the pain. And then they also rated their emotional experience during music listening. So we measured that in terms of circumplex valence, so pleasantness to unpleasantness, and circumplex arousal, so sort of physiological arousal. And so because we had these various variables, we could then use them to input them into a mediational model. So for the X, we had these continuous model-derived component scores. And then as the mediator, we had these individual experience variables, which were a 0 to 100 visual analog scale. And then, of course, the pain ratings. And so this is just an example of like how you can begin to build this kind of path structure. And then, so in terms of what we found, we showed on one hand that the depth and arousal dimensions impacted pain, so such that more calming and higher depth music led to less pain. But using mediation, we showed that this effect was through circumplex valence, or the pleasantness of their experience, rather than circumplex arousal. And another note, and something interesting that mediation can do, is that in this case, it was total mediation. So once we take into account the variance due to pleasantness, so that path that goes up through the mediator, the effect of music itself, which is what we call the C prime pathway, so with the little apostrophe there, it's the effect of the music while controlling for that mediator. That effect became non-significant. So what we're able to show here is that a very large portion of the variance in pain ratings was being explained by this route through pleasantness. And so one of the things I'm here to talk about today is that this is not just limited to behavioral data. We can also use it to probe neural and physiological correlates of the effects of music on pain. And importantly, it can extend what I have seen just in my experience reading a lot of papers, which is that sometimes we can show that music did cause a change in brain activity compared to the control condition. And at the same time, we might then also see effects on pain ratings. And sometimes it's very tempting to just stop there. However, what you've shown is that, yes, you have had different brain activity between conditions, but we don't necessarily know, and we haven't shown that that change specifically is what was having an impact on the pain ratings. So for example, we could show that music versus silence increases activity in the auditory cortex, but we might not assume that it's that increase in activity in the auditory cortex that's explaining the most of the pain relief. So mediation lets us link the brain activity that is changed by music to the differences in pain ratings by adding that B path that we estimate. And so just to give a second example that's more relevant to my study in general is that, so here on the right, I've modeled what was different in the 3 minutes of people listening to favorite music versus a scrambled control, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. And generally what we see here is that it's a lot of different areas. So mediation lets us take it a step further and ask more broadly, okay, within this general effect that music is having, what is the activity that is the most impactful for pain, or what is the B path? And this path modeling approach is great because it can be used for any type of data that is multi-level. So you might have clusters of observations within a participant, and also multivariate. So you might have more than one possible value that's acting as the mediator within a given observation, as in the case when we're testing across multiple voxels of the brain. So each time we're testing little 3 millimeter by 3 millimeter cubes. And so the same approach isn't just limited to fMRI. We can also use EEG data. So on one hand, we could use event-related potentials, or look at activity in different frequencies. So generally, what we would then do is run mediation on every single data point and then correct for multiple comparisons to find mediators that come out as significant. And so I'll describe a bit more how I'm using this to look at the impacts of music on pain. So myself and my colleague in South Korea, Yoo-Jin Jung, are running a large-scale fMRI study. So she collected 75 participants. I collected 63. And the idea was that we first got people to submit favorite music that they really, really liked. So I got them to submit 10. And then they came back on day 2 to listen to these pieces of music, as well as the scrambled music controls, and give continuous ratings of how much they liked the music as the song went on. And so what do I mean by scrambled music? So one of the ways that we've tried to find a good control for music is to take the same song, but to split it into lots and lots of small segments that importantly have a variable duration. And then these are then rearranged at random. So the general idea is to remove as many of the higher level aspects of music as possible, like the melody, the rhythm, the contours, and the phrasing, while retaining as many lower level acoustic features as possible, like the possible pitch range, the timbre, and the loudness. And so I'm going to play an example. I'm sorry if your volume is very loud, just to give you an idea of what it sounds like. And just for fun, you might want to try and guess what song it is. So here goes. Whoop. All right, so that's just to give you an example of what they then listen to for 3 minutes at a time during the study.
Elise, I don't know if it's possible to increase the volume a bit on your end.
On mine?
It was
Sure.
We could barely hear it.
Okay, I'm going to take my headphone off for a second because it's very loud on my end, but I'll play it again. Oh, hold on.
That was much better.
You heard it then?
When you took off your headphones or whatever.
Yeah. Oh, you know why? It's because the audio is coming through here.
Okay.
Anyway, well, I hope with that you got at least an idea of what this manipulation is like. So that was Head Over Heels by Tears for Fears. So for every single participant, I did that to all of their favorite songs. And on day 3, they came back for an fMRI task where we had them listen to the intact versions of their songs, the scrambled versions, paired one time with pain stimulations and one time without pain stimulations, as well as 4 silence control trials. And so what they would do is that they would be in the scanner, lying back, listening to the music or the scrambled music, and towards the end of the song, they would get 4 jittered pain stimulations to a calibrated temperature. And then afterwards, they would give a pain rating of how painful were those stimulations, as well as a pleasure rating of how much they enjoyed the music in the scanner. And so to highlight how mediation might support our interpretation of the results in this case, on one hand, I could show that, okay, music was generally much more enjoyable than the scrambled music control. So here, while scrambled was quite variable, in general, the music was rated as much higher. I could also show that music was then associated with less pain. So here I've plotted the mean standardized pain rating for each condition derived from a multi-level mixed model. So this is after controlling for other variables and the clustering within participants. And more broadly, what you should take from this is that compared to the average rating, the pain rating across the experiment, music tended to reduce pain, silence tended to increase pain, and scrambled music was variable. But with mediation, I am able to link these two effects together to show that music reduces pain through this impact on pleasure. So whether it was music or scrambled music was a good predictor of how pleasurable they found the music to be. And then this variation in the different pleasure ratings had a really big effect on the pain rating. And so that's just on the behavioral side of things, but I also did this in terms of the actual brain activity that we measured. So I applied the same technique to brain data. So what we were doing here was running a search where we're treating, again, every voxel or tiny cube of the brain as a potential mediator. And you run this path model essentially for every single one of those possible locations. And then you threshold the results and correct for multiple comparisons. And so we were able to narrow the effect down further to just a few areas, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, which I'm highlighting just because it mediated both the effects of music versus scrambled music, which is in the light blue there, and also music versus silence, which is in the dark blue. And another reason to highlight it is that it's then consistent with our observations of higher pleasure ratings because the VMPFC is involved in sort of mesolimbic circuitry, implicated in reward processing and kind of computing the relative value of different rewards and behaviors. So then, as I mentioned before, that's a jumping off point to then link the effects of music to a lot of other things. So knowing that, we could then look into physiological correlates of reward, into dopamine, into other stimuli that activate the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. So I just wanted to highlight that sort of depth of knowledge aspect again to bring this back to what I talked about earlier. And so that's the majority of what I have to present, but I also wanted to share some resources for getting started with mediation. I've done it in R, Python, and MATLAB, so you can pick your poison. And I wanted this presentation to be more of a sales pitch for mediation rather than a lecture on it. So that's a lot of due diligence that you could and should do, but I would really recommend it as a really fun way of particularly investigating brain activity. So I'd like to say thank you to Mathieu and my lab, as well as my funding. I'm happy to talk about this type of research, about mediation. I will take my questions.
Thank you, Elise. So we do have a few questions. Vanessa is asking, do you have references for other studies that use scrambled music? I wonder if anybody has ever used reversed music as control.
That is one of the things that comes to mind because it does change like some aspects of it. I found, in our lab, we use scrambled music quite a bit. I think we've used it in at least one published study and 2 unpublished studies, as well as like working with other colleagues that have used it and developed it. I think one of the first people to use it, was Daniel Levitin. But there are some, but not very many, studies looking at the impacts of scrambled music on the brain in the scanner. So one thing I'd like to do with my research is to maybe compare and contrast. But the point about reverse music is great. The one thing I would say is that potentially you might not be able to remove the beat as strongly because it would be at the same time points, just in reverse. And one of the reasons why I stressed that we use a different size window before we rearrange it is because we wanted to try our best. Obviously, this works better for some songs rather than others, but try our best to remove the beat or like very strong kind of metrical time points. Yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Great. And Vanessa, I see that you had a question during when Elise was explaining her second experiment, how it's been measured in this case, but I believe she answered that they were asking people to rate pain intensity and pain unpleasantness afterwards. And I assume, Elise, that you shared that it's probably a 0 to 10 scale, correct?
It's a 0 to 100, but
Okay.
yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yes, if people have other questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A box. We would love to answer your questions. Elise, we do have a question coming in. Mark Jensen is asking, I have recently completed analyses of a pilot study to examine EEG bandwidth activity as a mediator of the effects of music-based intervention. And the largest effect, which were statistically significant, even with the small n of the study, were for frontal midline theta as a mediator. Do you have any sense of the bandwidth of the activity that were measured at the VMPFC?
This is where I'm going to come out and say that I'm really not that familiar with EEG research. It's something that I haven't ever done or been trained on. So I think in short, no. And our interpretation is being kind of more so guided by like other studies that have found the VMPFC, for example, as a mediator of the effects of like a self-control intervention on pain. So at least in our case, more so about like linking it to other concepts rather than theta wavelengths, which I will look into now that now it's been brought up. I think that's an interesting area to look into to try and understand the data.
Yeah. Question I have for you, as this was your PhD research. What was for you kind of maybe the biggest surprise as well as the biggest learning curve as a PhD student? And then where do you want to take this next?
Yeah, okay. It's funny, it's like the learning curve came to my brain first, so I'll talk about that. When I started my PhD, I had done very limited coding in R, like the programming language. And so when I started my PhD, I had to learn how to do all of this and fMRI and set up the study and train to be a technician and learn 2 other coding languages. And so it felt really intense at the beginning, but I think that training like has put me in a really good, I feel like I'm in a good place now with kind of what I know and how I like to analyze neuroimaging data. And then as a surprise, I think it was one thing that was surprising was just surprising and not surprising, but just the music that people would pick and all sorts of the different reasons why they chose the music that they chose, because they were just instructed to have something that would be highly pleasurable, keeping in mind that they were also going to listen to it in a very loud and cramped environment. And someone chose like a Weird Al Yankovic song. There was all sorts of like kind of crazy choices that, when talking to the people afterwards, like it is the music that they really enjoy and that really makes them happy. So that, and also just the kind of really broad scope of how we have been looking at music for pain. So I'm very lucky to also have been involved in this big scoping review that some of us have been working on. And there were aspects of that I hadn't looked into. So one example that I hadn't thought about, but now is an area that I would like to learn more about. And I guess like to answer your question about where to go next, it's the influence of kind of like the like motor processes, which I think relates a lot more to as well, like more like active music interventions and getting a bit closer to Obviously what I do is so removed from like music therapy, but it's all trying to sort of like bridge this gap. And one thing I was thinking about, like, that comes up as sort of, I'm always thinking about different experiments, but I also, in my spare time, I do a lot of dance. And so, thinking about the effects of music on pain, you can really easily extend that to the effects of music plus movement. And like that's an area that I'm also super interested in. So yeah, I hope we went a lot of places in that answer, but I hope that makes sense.
And in the meantime, some questions came in. So,
Mm-hmm.
question by Rick Harris. How much might simple distraction be playing a role in pain relief? Might a pleasurable intervention be more
Mm-hmm.
distracting and hence reduce pain?
Mm-hmm. That is an amazing question because it lets me talk about another study that I didn't present, but is done. We're working on the manuscript right now, where that is a really good point, and a kind of limitation of some existing studies is that you can show that maybe even though someone is listening to maybe say unpleasant music, you might not want to be paying attention to that. And at the same time, even running my study, I would have some participants that were like, oh my God, I can't believe you're making me listen to the scrambled music. And so for time, I didn't include it, but a way we chose to look into that was to replicate, or at least replicate the design of a study looking into whether distraction needs to be involved for placebo. And the idea is that if you say, okay, well, if music has to work through distraction, if distraction is the main mechanism, we also assume that our attentional capacity is limited. There's only so many things that we can pay attention to. So what we were trying to do is to see if the effects of music on pain were removed when you do a challenging like cognitive task. So we had people doing the two-back. So you're looking at letters on the screen and you're answering if the ones you were seeing before were the same or different. And it's really hard. And so we found that we still got effects of music on pain even when we were giving people like a challenging task as opposed to a very simple task, so just doing left to right on the screen. And so it's it's a question that comes up again and again, and it's one I've done like a lot of thinking about. And I think the answer is that like I don't think you can say. I think the answer is more so to integrate it into like how distraction might also then be able to like enhance the intervention. So I think based on some of our results in our studies, like we can show that it isn't necessary to be kind of like really intently focusing on the music to get the effect. But at the same time, I think the sense of sort of like immersion in music and maybe even like a sense of flow that you get when you're listening to music or even playing music that you're very, very passionate about. I think that goes beyond kind of simple distraction and more so into like an integrated, absorbing experience.
Yeah, and I would add to that. I know we addressed that in the scoping. We just
Mm,
completed with our network and together with the other pain network a scoping review that is now under review, looking at mechanisms. And one thing we wrote in there too was that the fact that some studies show that when people listen to music before the
mm,
onset of the pain experiment and not during the pain experiment, but
mm,
still report reduced pain if they were able to listen to music before the experiment, also suggests that something else is going on, the distraction, right? So it could be
mm,
dopamine release that has, delayed impact or continuing impact. But if music were to mainly operate through distraction, that wouldn't explain how people would still report less pain, when they're no longer listening to music during
mm,
a pain experiment. Another question we have here, considering the new research on pain as being ultimately constructed by the brain, how
mm.
do you help those understand the perceived rate of pain? Not quite sure I understand the question completely. Do you understand the question?
Um, there's sort of like two interpretations I have. Like one is asking like how do you help people to understand what intensity is versus what unpleasantness is? Is that what they're getting at, I think? And then there's also this like broader question of understanding pain as a distributed experience in general that I have a supplementary slide about, so I can also talk about that. But first, so for differentiating intensity and unpleasantness, there's different ways you can do it. I mean, the best case is that you talk to them and you describe sort of what you are asking them to rate before the experiment, and you check that they understand before you actually do it. But in a lot of cases, like sometimes we do intensity and unpleasantness, sometimes we do just one composite measure of pain. There's different sort of intricacies of why you would do one or the other. But to speak to sort of like understanding this distributed representation, so one part of my slides that I didn't include just because it's a bit more of a complicated topic is we also use pain neurosignatures. So these are distributed patterns of activity that you get from, hold on, I have my supplementary slides. So on one hand, like you could run a regression for every single voxel of the brain in order to predict activity. But another way is instead of treating every single voxel as a separate outcome, we can use sort of like machine learning and lasso PCR to reduce those dimensions. And instead of thousands of separate models, we just have one whole brain pattern that then predicts pain. So we can then use that as a model of pain. So here I just have an example of like how we use them. So we can estimate like how well our brain activity matches these models and then show changes in that match as a model of changes in the pain-related activity. So broadly, we take the voxel weights within, say, a simulation, and you can compute the dot product of that activity and the pattern, and you get what's called a pattern expression score. So we can then use that pattern expression score in mediation, which I'll discuss in a second. And so what I have on the right is just sort of showing like the first signature that was developed is called the neurologic pain signature. And we can use it to show that it was impacted by the opiate remifentanil. So the graph on the very bottom is the dose curve for remifentanil administration. And what you can see on the top is that red line. Every single dot there is a painful stimulation, and we can show that the pattern expression is changing at the same time as that dose curve. So it's kind of showing that it's sensitive to pain, but the trajectory was the same whether the dose administration was open or hidden. So it's showing that that signature is influenced by the drug, but not necessarily expectations about drug delivery. And finally, just extending this further, I use two different signatures in my research. So on that point of the fact that pain is a multifaceted, multidimensional whole brain experience, we have the NPS, which more generally sort of tracks nociceptive input. So kind of the information that is just coming into the nervous system that is more so related to like intensity. And so it captures sort of like how hot is the stimulus. But at the same time, so these are some of our colleagues actually, as well as Mathieu, they developed a second signature by controlling for the first one, as well as the intensity of the stimulus. So for thermal heat, that's like how hot it is. And so what you get is something that captures other contributions to pain that are non-nociceptive. So they're more sort of motivational and emotional. And as a result, it's more sensitive to psychological manipulations. So the SIPs, the second one, is more sensitive to, say, like placebo. And so we had a hypothesis that music would probably be impacting pain via this second neurosignature, because not only are we expecting the effects to be more sort of emotional, motivational, but also when I'm, doing my testing, I'm only giving each person one single stimulation temperature. So I'm not actually changing the nociceptive input to the brain. And I think then, if I have my animation correct, so I was able to show that the effect of music versus silence on pain was mediated by the SIPs, that second neurosignature. And what I'm working on right now, wondering why I didn't put this in, but what I'm working on right now is a similar set of models, but with two mediators. So in theory, what we want to do is be able to show that music causes a general effect of music. So within that 180-second period of music listening, music versus our control is doing something. And then what I want to do is to model a second mediator, which would be the change in specifically pain-related activity that would then predict pain ratings. So all of this to say, there's a lot you can do, and we definitely are in our lab considering this kind of like multidimensional whole brain nature of pain.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Ting Tingo is asking, are the participants selected favorite pieces all in English, or do they include a mix of other languages?
That's a great question. So I didn't restrict at all based on what language the songs were in. So all of the participants were fluent in English, but they weren't necessarily first language English speakers. And so some chose, I should do a graph of like all the different languages, because there was like French, there was Mandarin, there was Spanish, there was German. There were really a lot, because I didn't want to say, oh, you shouldn't be able to listen to the music that you want to listen to just because of the fact that I won't be able to understand the song. Like the idea was to really try and get what was the most enjoyable to that person specifically. So if that song happened to be Italian opera, that was okay.
Yeah, and it's a very interesting question because as a non-native speaker myself, I know when I listen to English songs, of course, I enjoy that music, but I do know when I listen to a song in my native language, and especially, I guess, because I don't live in the country anymore,
Mm-hmm.
it awakens a whole set of other feelings, nostalgia or
Mm-hmm.
memories, or yeah, even certainly in the beginning when I was here, some homesickness, but
Mm-hmm.
also that it's like so closely connected to your identity
Mm-hmm.
that I do think a study comparing as having participants who are non-native English speakers listening to an English song that they really like, that they identify as one of their, top favorite songs, and then have them listen to top favorite song in their own language and see
Mm-hmm.
what happens in the brain with that would be. I don't know if anybody has done that, but I think that would be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Here's another question. How would you design a study to look at the mechanisms of music in an unconscious state? The hypothesis is that the autonomic nervous system mediates the effect.
Okay, well, I mean, in that case, you would want, like, again, it would go back to what I was discussing with the idea of like something with good subtractive logic. So it really depends on what if your autonomic effect is like heart rate, then maybe you would want two songs where, in theory, again, I'd have to ask the question of like, do we think that people who are unconscious can entrain to music? And they might very well be. That's just an area that I haven't read as much on. But given that, I think the question is sort of asking like, because you can't then take like a behavioral rating, you would need to use, there are people that do study like pain in people who are unconscious, and I'm sure that they've come up with a set of very like solid measures for how they are inferring pain or no pain in that individual. It's not an area of the research that I'm super familiar with, but I would go back to maybe like, say we thought it was to do with like heart rate, then maybe as well you could manipulate the like the speed of the music, the tempo of the music. You could present the same song at different tempos, different tempi even. And I think that might be a good way to do it. That was a good challenge, like something probably I'll keep thinking about after we finish this Q&A.
Yeah. And there are definitely clinical studies that have looked, efficacy studies that have looked
Mhm.
at the effect of music on pain when people are under general anesthesia, and then
Okay.
looking at postoperative pain, for example. And that certainly when people listen to music during surgery, they report less pain following the surgery. But I
Hmm.
don't know of any mechanistic studies that have been done in this
Hmm.
area. That would be certainly an interesting area of
Hmm.
research. Here's another question by Dr. Jensen. Music that could reduce pain can also vary with respect to how calming or relaxing it is versus how activating it is. Have you
Hmm.
considered examining how favorite music that varies among this continuum might moderate the underlying mechanisms, even though both might be pleasurable?
Yeah, so that's interesting because that's kind of taking what we had discussed in the first study, but maybe sort of operationalizing that like within a person. And I do think that's very interesting. I think a natural next step of my study is to sort of extend that question of like, okay, well, how do we best maximize that idea of like musical pleasure, that intervention in that person? Um, and so, like, yeah, with the example of maybe manipulating the sort of like intensity of it, the thing that springs to my mind is that even within all the songs that I really enjoy, I have songs that might be more appropriate for maybe say like studying or working, and songs that I want to listen to. Like the music I listen to at the gym is not the music that I listen to in my everyday life when I'm like home and relaxing. So when I've thought about that question myself, that's kind of what comes up for me. So maybe to take like still well loved, self selected music, but maybe songs that kind of vary on these different dimensions. And something that could complement that quite well is that in some of my studies, I've used so music streaming services and platforms have kind of their own internal variables that they assign to songs for the purposes of music recommendation. So kind of behind maybe say like the Pandora algorithm or why Spotify is giving you certain songs over others. And there are ways to get those values of how, like what Spotify is assigning. So for example, you have like the probability that the song contains lyrics, you have valence, speechiness, things like that. And so obviously those are probably not like 100% accurate measurements, but that's maybe another way to, if you wanted to take all these different self-selected songs, begin to maybe kind of quantify and look at what was working well in a different scenario. Maybe matching how sort of the arousal level of that song to maybe that kind of like current heart rate during experiment. Like, is the person coming to the study very sort of like tense and anxious, or is the person coming to the study trying to chill out? That might vary between people, but it's again sort of like and I don't think my study was really about like, please let's just get something that you really really enjoy, to try and sort of like examine and be able to show that kind of the reward activity is involved. But I think definitely I'm always thinking about as well. It's like sometimes when I'm listening to a song that is appropriate to kind of like the situation I'm in, I'm like, I like this, but maybe if I did this in the study, it wouldn't have been as enjoyable. So I think that's a great point, and I hope I at least answered some of the question.
Yeah, it's a great response. I don't see any other questions right now. If anybody still has any burning questions for Elise, feel free to put them in the chat. I mean, in the Q&A. Somebody is writing here in the chat. Elise, thank you for this presentation. I did that exactly recently, analyze the characteristics of relaxation music. I wonder if you will make your music data set available.
Yeah, so the idea is like when we publish the paper, we've got to compile these like massive lists of all of the songs that they chose for the experiment. All of them are available on either iTunes or Spotify. So my response to that would be, stay tuned. We're still analyzing the data because we have sort of other more like complex models we'd like to run. But eventually, watch this space. You can add me on LinkedIn if you would like. And at that point, you will definitely know once I publish the paper. But it's our intent is to make the data set open.
And we will definitely announce it on our Music for Pain website as well. Those very relevant papers are being published. We want to bring this to everybody's attention, or it will be included in our newsletter. So if there's no further questions, Elise, I want to thank you for this wonderful presentation and also for your really thorough answers to people's questions. That was really very helpful. And I just want to remind everyone here in this space who is interested in doing similar types of research and who is looking for some pilot funding to fund initial research efforts, please know that we offer pilot funding, and you can go to our website. There are still opportunities to submit. I believe the next letter of intent due date is April 1st or May 1st, maybe. Go to our website to look. And we also offer training programs, or I will say reimbursement for training. So if people are looking to gain any specific research skills, related to a research idea they have. It has to be related to mechanistic research in music for pain management. Please check out the Visiting Scholars program that we have. We offer reimbursement for up to $5,000 for a training experience of up to 3 weeks in a host lab of your choosing. And then, of course, keep an eye on our website also for additional webinars, publications that come out. And then finally, we also offer consulting sessions. So if you are thinking of submitting an NIH grant related to music and pain, please check out the consulting that we offer. It's completely free to you, and we offer it about 2 months before the due date, or at any time really that you would like to get some input on a grant that you're submitting. You can get matched with one of us to get some feedback. We take a look at your AIMS page, for example, and offer you some feedback, or are happy to meet with you about any specific design questions that you may have. So all of that information is on our website, and we really hope that you take advantage of this as we, collectively try to increase the amount of mechanistic research in this space, as well as also the rigor of the research that is being done. So with that, let me make sure that in the chat there were no more questions, no, just some links to websites, I believe. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. All right, bye-bye.
Cool.